I am an old woman now, living a quiet, retired life in a small coastal town where the only drama is the tide coming in and out. To pass the time, I listen to a lot of true crime podcasts, letting the narrators' voices fill the silence of my kitchen. Sometimes a story comes on that sounds eerily familiar, triggering memories I've spent decades trying to suppress. There is one particular story from my youth that I have never heard anyone tell on a show before. It began back in the mid-1980s when I was a 20-year-old student at a community college in the heart of the Pacific Northwest. The campus was a collection of damp brick buildings surrounded by ancient, towering pines that always seemed to be whispering. Since I was from out of state, I lived in the university dorms to save money and avoid a long commute. Our unit was a shared suite with 6 girls, each having a tiny private room connected to a central area. The walls in those dorms were paper thin, and the cheap, scratchy carpet did nothing to dampen the noise of 5 other young women living their lives. You could hear everything: late-night phone calls, muffled crying after a breakup, or the heavy bass of someone's stereo. My roommates were a diverse bunch. Chloe was the loud one. Sarah was the obsessive pre-med student. Maya was always in trouble. And Jade was obsessed with gothic horror and heavy metal. Then there was Rebecca, who spent every Friday night on the phone with her parents for hours. And finally, me. I was the quiet one who worked a part-time job at a local diner and kept my head down, focusing on my grades while occasionally attending a campus bonfire. We all got along well enough that we decided to stay in the same suite for the following semester. We had no idea that our peaceful academic life was about to be shattered by a local nightmare. That summer, while most students were away, a young woman was found barely clinging to life in a narrow alleyway just a few blocks from the campus gate. I didn't know her personally, but the local news was filled with grim reports about the severity of her internal injuries. At first, the investigators suggested it might have been a tragic hit-and-run accident where the driver panicked and dragged her into the shadows to hide the evidence of the crime. The incident was the talk of the town for a week. You couldn't buy a coffee without hearing someone speculate about what had actually happened in that alley. But as the days turned into weeks and the police remained tight-lipped, the fear began to fade into the background noise of daily life. By the time the fall semester rolled around and we moved back into the dorms, the alley was just a place students avoided after dark out of a vague sense of unease. The relative peace only lasted until the 3rd week of the semester, when a second girl was discovered in another part of town. This time, there were no comforting theories about car accidents or random bad luck to settle the public's nerves. The victim was found in a similar alleyway, and even though the police wouldn't release the specifics, the entire community could see a terrifying pattern emerging. The atmosphere on campus shifted almost instantly. The university transformed overnight into a high-security zone, with extra patrol cars and yellow warning flyers taped to every single dormitory door. Our dorm director called a mandatory meeting, looking pale, as he told us never to walk alone and to always trust our gut instincts. We were already terrified, but being told by an authority figure that we were in danger made the threat feel suffocating. We stopped going anywhere without a partner. Trips to the grocery store became group expeditions, and the local student bars were empty long before their usual closing times. Every man we didn't recognize suddenly looked like a threat, a glowing red flag in a sea of suspicion. Not long after the second discovery, a 3rd girl was found, and the realization of our absolute powerlessness hit us like a physical blow. Nothing the community did seemed to be stopping the predator lurking in our midst. The authorities finally stopped sugarcoating the situation and issued a series of graphic warnings while enforcing a strict city-wide curfew. They believed the killer was a local man in his late 30s, someone who was intimately familiar with the layout of the town and could vanish into the night. This description was so generic that it made every neighbor and professor look like a monster, keeping us in a state of constant, high-alert paranoia. The sudden influx of information caused a strange, haunting silence to settle over the town as the murders abruptly stopped for several weeks. No new bodies were found and no arrests were made, leaving us in a state of suspended animation where we were too afraid to relax, but too exhausted to stay vigilant. We kept our dorm door double-locked at all times, and the lights in the common room stayed on throughout the night. Even Jade, who used to love slasher films, couldn't bring herself to watch anything scary anymore. We all harbored the same unspoken fear that he was still out there, hiding in plain sight and waiting for one of us to make a single mistake. That tension broke when a girl from a neighboring dorm filed a police report about a man who had followed her home from a local diner. She described him as a shadow that stayed behind her for blocks, matching her pace with aggressive intent. When she ducked into an alley, he followed. When she began to run, he broke into a sprint to catch her. By sheer luck, she managed to slip through the back door of a business that was being cleaned late at night, escaping just seconds before he reached her. By the time the police arrived at the scene, the mysterious figure had vanished into the darkness of the city. The story spread through the campus like a wildfire, fueled by the fact that she had actually seen him. She described a tall man in a dark work jacket and heavy boots, someone who looked completely ordinary but possessed a terrifying, silent fury. On a rainy Sunday night around 11, the six of us were huddled in our common room, trying to distract ourselves with laundry and textbooks. The campus outside was deathly quiet, save for the occasional flash of a passing patrol car's lights. Suddenly there was a sharp, rhythmic knocking on our door 1, 2, 3 times. Everyone froze in place, and Chloe crept toward the peephole. She turned back to us, her breath hitching as she whispered that it was a police officer. I looked through the lens next and saw a man in a crisp uniform, but something about his appearance felt fundamentally wrong to my eyes. The insignia on his shoulder patch wasn't one I recognized from the local department, and his gaze was unsettlingly flat. "Open the door," he commanded through the wood, claiming there was a situation nearby and he needed to inspect our unit. Sarah shook her head in terror, while Rebecca whispered that this couldn't be happening to us right now. Jade didn't hesitate for a single second. She grabbed the kitchen phone and immediately dialed 911 to verify his identity with dispatch. The man's demeanor shifted instantly when he heard her speaking to the operator, and he began screaming and throwing his weight against the door. He realized the ruse was over and fled down the hallway, leaving behind a heavy clattering sound on the floor as he ran off. We huddled together in the center of the room, waiting for the real authorities to arrive. Within minutes, the hallway was flooded with the harsh light of professional flashlights and the sound of real officers shouting. They apprehended the man across the street as he tried to blend into the shadows of the student parking lot. We later learned that the noise we had heard was a heavy hammer and a long screwdriver hitting the floor, the very tools he had used in his previous crimes. The realization that I had almost opened the door for a killer sent me into a state of total shock. The police took our statements and moved us out of the dorms that very night, our parents arriving by morning to take us far away from the campus. The man's name was eventually released to the press along with a mugshot, but he was a complete stranger to all of us. I finished that semester from home and never returned to that town, leaving the dorms behind for new students to inhabit. I often wonder if those new residents know they are sleeping in the same beds where we were almost murdered. The second memory that haunts me took place years later while I was driving through a desolate stretch of highway in the high deserts of West Texas. Land there is flat and unforgiving, a place where you can see for 15 miles in every direction without spotting a single bend in the road. Out of nowhere, my car began to jerk violently to the right as the steering went loose and the dashboard lit up with warning icons. I coasted to the shoulder, the sound of flapping rubber echoing. When I stepped out, the heat radiating off the asphalt was suffocating, and the silence of the desert felt like a physical weight. My rear tire was shredded down to the metal rim, and a dark fluid was beginning to leak from the undercarriage. Anxiety flared in my chest as I popped the hood, only to be met with a hiss of steam and the acrid smell of burnt oil. I grabbed my phone, but as I expected in this barren wasteland, there wasn't a single bar of signal to be found anywhere. I paced along the dusty shoulder, holding my phone high in the air, as if that would somehow summon a signal from the empty sky. The highway was a ghost road, stretching into the horizon without a single car in sight to offer any hope of rescue. I checked the trunk, only to find a jack and a tire iron, but no spare tire, a discovery that made me want to scream at my own negligence. The engine ticked nearby as it cooled, and the eerie clicking of cicadas began to rise from the brush. The sun began to drop, casting a washed-out, orange light over the scrubland as the intense heat started to bleed out of the ground. I sat on the metal guardrail and took stock of my supplies, some water, a few protein bars, and a light jacket. It was enough to survive the night, but the realization that help might not come for hours made my stomach churn with unease. I stayed close to the car because there was nowhere else to go in this vast, empty expanse of desert. Every few minutes, I waved my phone light down the road, acting more out of desperate habit than any real hope of being seen. I had truly never felt as alone as I did in that moment, surrounded by a silence so deep it felt like the world had ended. Then a low rumble broke the quiet. A rough, struggling engine without a muffler was approaching from the distance. It sounded like a chariot of salvation in my ears as two headlights finally cut through the fading twilight. The vehicle was a black, lifted van riding on thick off-road tires, its windshield so dark that the driver was completely invisible. I stepped toward the shoulder and waved my light frantically until the van slowed down and pulled over right behind me. The engine stayed running as a man in his mid-20s hopped down from the driver's side, looking thin and wired. He wore a bandana and sunglasses, even though it was nearly dark, a cigarette burning in his hand. "Hell of a place to get stuck, isn't it?" he said with a small, knowing smile that didn't quite reach his hidden eyes. I explained my situation, mentioning the flat tire and the lack of cell service, while he just chuckled and looked around the desert. He repeated the phrase, "no service," as if it were a joke, which started to make the hair on the back of my neck stand up. He offered to help and crouched by the wheel, clicking on a flashlight that was blindingly bright. The beam illuminated a long, jagged strip of steel wedged deep into the wheel well, something he claimed must have fallen off a trailer. He helped me jack the car up, his van's headlights flooding the scene and making the highway behind us vanish into a void of black. We struggled with the lug nuts for a while until he claimed something was catching in the back where he couldn't see. He looked at me with a strange grin and told me he needed me to crawl underneath. I hesitated, listening to the jack creak under the weight of the vehicle, but I was so desperate to leave that I ignored my intuition. He promised to hold the flashlight for me, so I slid onto my back and moved under the cold, oil-scented frame of the car. I couldn't see anything out of place and asked him to angle the light better so I could get a clearer look at the axle. Suddenly, the light exploded with a white-hot intensity that made my entire body lock up. The flash was so powerful, it felt like he had tasered my eyes, sending me into a blind, primal state of panic. Above me, I heard the metal shift and felt the car rock violently, as if someone had given it a powerful, intentional shove. I twisted and rolled my body sideways just as the jack snapped loose and the heavy frame slammed into the asphalt. The car hit the ground right where I had been laying, leaving a deep, jagged dent in the road. I scrambled backward into the dirt, screaming at him, but his face had gone completely flat and emotionless as he watched me. He tried to claim it was an accident, but I didn't stay to listen. I bolted straight into the dark brush of the desert. I dropped behind a low rise and stayed perfectly still, watching him pace along the road with his blinding flashlight. He kept repeating that it was an accident, his voice sounding nervous as he searched the bush for me. I refused to move, determined not to let him have the satisfaction of finding me in the darkness where I was finally safe. Eventually, the van door slammed shut, the engine revved, and the headlights looped across the shoulder before disappearing. I stayed hidden for 2 more hours, unable to trust that he was truly gone and not just waiting with his lights off. When I finally returned to my car, the road was silent and empty, leaving me alone with my wounded vehicle. I stayed inside my locked car until the sun began to peek over the desert horizon, illuminating the dust in the air. A highway patrol car pulled over shortly after sunrise, and the officer listened intently as I described the man and his van. The trooper's expression darkened when I mentioned the blinding light and the way the car was pushed off the jack. He told me I wasn't the first person to report that specific vehicle or those terrifying tactics along this road. Later that evening, the officer called to inform me that they had apprehended the suspect outside a small town nearby. Inside his van, they found evidence linking him to several mysterious roadside deaths that had occurred over the last few years. I travel very differently now, always carrying a spare tire and staying on the main highways whenever I can. That night in the desert taught me that some predators don't live in alleys. They roam the open roads. The final story that lingers in my mind takes me back to my childhood in a quiet town called Oak Haven. It was a sleepy community where the houses all looked the same, and the same families lived there for generations. A slow, murky river ran behind our neighborhood, but none of the local kids ever gave it much of a second thought. That changed during the spring of my 5th grade year when a fisherman discovered a heavy suitcase in the water. The news spread through our small town like a sickness, starting with whispers on the school bus and ending with grim faces. My father sat us down at the kitchen table and told us plainly that the police had recovered a body from the river. The detail that stuck with me most was that the victim had been hidden inside a piece of luggage. It was terrifying to imagine a person being fitted into something meant for a family vacation. The rumors at school became increasingly graphic as we learned the victim had been carefully dismembered to fit the space. No one knew who she was, and the lack of an identity made the crime feel even more cold and calculated. Our parents began locking the doors at all times, and my father started patrolling our backyard with a flashlight every night. We realized that the person who did this didn't just disappear. They probably lived right among us. By the end of that long, hot summer, 2 more bodies were pulled from the water in the exact same manner. One was found in another suitcase, and the other had been stuffed into a large canvas duffel bag. Everyone in Oak Haven knew it was the same killer, and the police were struggling to find any actionable leads. Our neighborhood turned into a fortress, with fathers watching from their porches holding baseball bats or golf clubs. Despite the danger, my friends and I, Leo, Marcus, and Julian, spent our afternoons holed up in a bedroom. We had a clear view of the river path from the second floor and spent hours studying everyone who passed by. Using a pair of old hunting binoculars, we scrutinized every jogger, dog walker, and parked car for anything suspicious. We were convinced the killer was a local man who knew exactly where the river's current was strongest. The paranoia reached its peak when a fourth discovery was made further downstream, causing the police to swarm the area. This time there was no body, only an incredible amount of blood that left the investigators baffled and the town in shock. The river was officially closed off to the public, and we were warned repeatedly never to go near the water. Naturally, because we were young and foolish, that only made us want to investigate the site ourselves. We planned our mission with the seriousness of soldiers, packing fresh batteries and a cheap disposable camera. We met at the edge of the police tape at midnight, our hearts hammering against our ribs as we crawled underneath. The woods were thick and dark, and every snapping twig made us flinch as if a hand were reaching out for us. We found nothing at first, just the steady, oppressive sound of the river rushing nearby. When we finally reached the bank, we stood in a tense silence, waiting for a sign of the monster we were hunting. Leo pointed toward an old concrete bridge that was barely wide enough for 2 cars to cross at once. We weren't supposed to be there, and the sight of it made my stomach do a slow, nauseating backflip. As we moved closer, we saw the glow of headlights and the silhouette of a large vehicle parked on the span. An old, battered RV sat idling on the center of the bridge, its brake lights glowing like 2 angry red eyes in the dark. The passenger door hung wide open, and we could hear the faint, rhythmic clinking of metal coming from inside the vehicle. We crouched low in the tall grass, knowing that being spotted by the driver would likely mean our certain death. "What is he doing?" Marcus whispered, his voice trembling as he gripped the edge of the camera. The answer came a moment later when a heavy, blocky object was tipped over the side of the concrete railing. It teetered on the edge for an agonizing second before sliding off and plummeting into the dark water with a deep splash. Even from the bank, I recognized the shape immediately. It was a large suitcase, falling as a single, solid unit into the river. The man leaned over the rail to watch his handiwork, his face obscured by the deep shadows of the bridge. I watched as his hand moved rhythmically against his jeans, a gesture that made my skin crawl with a sense of pure, unadulterated evil. He eventually climbed back into the driver's seat and released the brake, allowing the RV to roll forward with a soft purr. The vehicle disappeared into the thick tree line on the far side of the river, leaving us alone in the silence of the night. We didn't move until the sound of the engine had faded completely into the distance. Once we were sure he was gone, we bolted back toward our neighborhood, Julian screaming for help as we reached the first line of houses. Porch lights began to flicker on as confused parents stepped outside to see what was wrong with us. We tried to explain the bridge and the suitcase, and that single word seemed to change the atmosphere instantly. My father immediately told my mother to call the police while he and several other neighbors headed toward the riverbank. Squad cars arrived within minutes, their red and blue lights painting the quiet suburban streets in chaotic, flashing colors. The officers separated the 4 of us and took our statements individually, asking us to repeat the details of the RV and the suitcase. They found the luggage within 15 minutes because the slow-moving current had snagged it on a cluster of fallen branches. One officer peeked inside the zipper and quickly closed it, his face turning pale. A massive search operation was launched immediately, with roadblocks going up on every major highway leading out of the county. They put out a description for an older, light-colored RV that was likely rusted out, but by morning there were still no suspects. Our school was closed the next day as the entire river area was condemned and guarded by armed patrolmen. Despite the presence of the authorities, I never felt safe, and I spent every hour glued to my bedroom window. I used Julian's binoculars to scan the streets, convinced that the killer would return to eliminate the witnesses who had seen him. A few days later, I saw an old RV drifting slowly through a street several blocks away, its windows too dark to see inside. I screamed for my parents, but the vehicle had already turned the corner and vanished by the time they reached the upstairs. They called 911 anyway, and the police returned once more to document my sighting. No one was ever arrested for the Oak Haven murders, at least not while I lived there, and the investigations eventually went cold. The killings stopped in our area as abruptly as they had started, and the river was eventually opened back up for fishing. Life slowly returned to a version of normal, but for years we were all convinced he would return to slit our throats. We grew up with the knowledge that a monster had walked our streets and slipped away into the night. Looking back on those 3 distinct chapters of my life, I realize how much they shaped the cautious person I have become today. Whether it was the dorm killer, the desert predator, or the man with the suitcase, each encounter left a permanent scar. I still double-check my locks every night and keep a wary eye on every stranger who lingers just a bit too long. The world is full of beautiful things, but I know better than most that the shadows are very real. I hope these stories serve as a reminder that danger doesn't always wear a monstrous face. Sometimes it looks like a neighbor or a helpful traveler. The thin veil of safety we feel in our daily routines can be torn away in a single, terrifying instant. Now, as I sit in my quiet home listening to my podcasts, I am grateful for the peace I finally found. I have survived the darkness, but I will never truly forget the faces of the men who tried to take it all away.